Hello, my merciful brothers and sisters. It is I, MisterMercy, bringing you another video with some Overwatch gameplay. And hey, I got my PC fixed! Hooray! So recently, I made a video talking about how you should really be dealing with toxic players, and it was an update to one of my previous videos that I did about, dealing with toxic players and stuff. So, while I still stand by everything that I said in that video, I asked myself after that was done, I said, what should Blizzard be doing to deal with toxic players? I mean, I've told you guys what to do with the tools that Blizzard has given us to handle toxic players in Overwatch. But even in my previous video, I complained about the usefulness of those tools in the first place. So it's clear that Blizzard should be giving us better tools and doing more to combat toxicity in their community. But what can they do? Well, I believe I have some ideas. Admittedly, this wasn't entirely all, me. This was partially due to the credit of Jamin from PBS Game Show. It's a show I used to watch a hell of a lot on YouTube before it got canceled. I would tell you to go subscribe, but they're since long been canceled, so don't bother subscribing because they don't upload anything new. But before we go into this, I wanted to look at what Blizzard does now. So basically, in Overwatch currently, all burden falls on the person reporting. Someone can report a player for harassment, cheating, spamming, or having an offensive battle tag. Now, the first thing we should notice here is that there's an absence of a reporting category for toxicity as well as trolling. And instead, they kind of lump those two together along with real serious physical threats into the harassment category. Now, this means that reports of people who are being toxic or even worse, threatening serious physical harm to others are being buried under all the reports of all the salty kids bitching that somebody picked Hanzo on their team to troll them, when, that might not have even been the case. So there's literally no other applicable category to report that under than harassment, which lets more serious toxicity as well as some potential serious threats to go missed by Blizzard. But regardless, when you fill out a report, you're left with just a small text box to explain yourself, which I've found not to be that helpful, because I don't want to, nor should I have to, sit at a keyboard for 20 minutes detailing every little hurtful thing that was said to me in order to explain why my report should be listened to. I shouldn't have to do that, because when you're feeling victimized, the last thing anyone wants to do is spend a long time recalling what made them upset in the first place. But let's say, just for the hell of this, that your cries for help are listened to, and a player consistently receives enough reports from other people for Blizzard to take action. Great, the day is saved, right? Well, not really. All Blizzard seems to do when punishing a player is silence their account, with the exception being for reports of cheating, because I've seen cheating actually result in actual bans from playing the game. But as far as I can tell, it's that kind of ban from playing the games only handed out to those who are caught cheating, not those who are being toxic. So while a silence can be permanent, they can permanently silence your account, all it does is take away their communication privileges, minus the ability to send whispers to friends. And like Dan from the YouTube show Extra Credits pointed out in a video that he did on the topic of harassment in games, not only does this not stop players from being hostile in other ways that don't involve communication, but it also punishes the rest of the team that the toxic player is paired up with, because now the team is stuck with a player who can't communicate with them. So, on top of Dan's points, I would like to add that the way Blizzard silences accounts doesn't really stop people from being toxic through communication either, because really all a toxic player that wants to be an asshole has to do, if they've been silenced, is simply add the person they want to harass as a friend on Battle.net. And since the player that toxic player is trying to harass hasn't had the chance to witness that toxic player's toxicity previously due to them being silenced, I mean, to them they're probably just, they look like just a normal, average, everyday player. All it takes is one naively accepted friend request for the abuse to start. and all that innocent player can do then is just unfriend them. But the damage and the hurt feelings will have already been done, and there is absolutely no further punishment that the toxic player can receive for doing that, because once they've been silenced, that's it. That's the severest punishment they can be, awarded. And there's nothing else that Blizzard can do to punish them. So there's also something to consider, which I don't think that Dan really thought about, is the buying and selling of Battle.net accounts. Because that online, that's very prevalent. I've heard and seen a lot of people talking about buying and selling accounts online for Battle.net. So really, there's nothing but cash standing in the way of a toxic player just simply buying their way out of a silence and just getting access to a whole new account to harass people on and be toxic. And I think this is how a lot of toxic players who have been silenced are actually going about continuing to be toxic, is that they just go on and buy a brand new account off of eBay, and they don't have to worry about their other account being silenced. So that's what Blizzard is currently doing, but what should they do? Well, while it has been offline for a couple of years and many people have argued about its effectiveness, I believe that the approach that Riot Games' League of Legends game has done sounds really, really good on paper, and from the early days, it did have the statistics to back it up as being effective. Now, I'm not a big League of Legends player. I tried getting into the game, but not really my thing. So I can't really say from experience about how well this system actually works, but it sounds great, and I think Blizzard could definitely improve on it. So basically, shortly after League of Legends came out, Riot Games, of course, the makers of the game, recruited not just people within the company, but also scholars, scientists, and psychologists, all to come together and come up with a way to combat the toxicity in their community. And they eventually found a solution, and they called it the Tribunal. Now, basically, for those that aren't familiar with it, the Tribunal worked like this. If a player was reported for toxicity, the game would automatically save copies of the chat logs of every game they were reported in so that they could be used as evidence later. The player would then get a warning message telling them that they've been reported and for what, and it would show them the evidence right in front of their eyes. Now, if that player continued to be toxic, then all of those pieces of those chat log evidences would be gathered up, and the toxic player would then have to face the Tribunal, which is a collection of higher-level players who would look at the evidence and then act as a jury to determine what punishment the player received. And according to the data back when, shortly after it came out, a couple years after it came out, I should say, 75% of the people reported to the Tribunal never needed to be punished again, and it improved their attitude. So that's 3/4 of the reports being sent into the Tribunal. They just never offended again. So I think those are some really great statistics. But the coolest thing that the Tribunal did is it didn't just feature a jury of fellow players. It also rewarded players who were making the community a better place. So players who were consistently cooperative in games or helped other players out to learn the game, maybe reported toxic players, stuff like that, they would be rewarded with special crests in-game that would show up next to their name to show everyone in the community that they were an upstanding member and one that could be trusted to keep the peace. So, like I said though, this was shut down in 2014 and hasn't made a return since, but I think that Riot Games had something here, and I think it would be perfect for something like Overwatch. So let's imagine this, okay? Let's imagine this, new, toxicity filtering system for Overwatch. So imagine that Overwatch had something similar to the Tribunal, but maybe they could instead call it like the United Nations of Overwatch or something. I know it's not the greatest name, but whatever. So in the United Nations of Overwatch, just like in the Tribunal, offenders would be notified that they were being reported, but the reporter would remain anonymous. However, while I think that the chat logs could still easily be recorded without too much of a fuss, it's much harder to keep track of voice comms, which are usually where the majority of toxicity occurs. This provides a bit of a problem since Blizzard can't realistically be eavesdropping on all voice comms in every game to catch toxic players. So instead, I think that there are a couple ways to get voice comms as evidence. And the first, it's a bit more painful, less accurate, and not as helpful. But it doesn't invade privacy. That's the big thing. So what they could do is offer text boxes upon reporting that are specifically for voice comm quotes. So the person could, type in a small text box, just a quote of what somebody had said to them in voice comms, and instead of having to, explain in a whole long paragraph, describe what a toxic person said to them. They would just have that small quote box to type into it. Although I can also see this method being abused to put words into the mouth of a person you're reporting, and then it kind of just becomes a he said, she said kind of thing, which doesn't really help. The second method is easier, more accurate, and extremely helpful, but it might make some people uncomfortable in terms of privacy. So my idea is to record both the chat logs and the voice comms, but only those of the person who hit report and those he or she is reporting would, be the ones that were actually saved. And I think Blizzard would need some kind of dedicated server farm just to provide this feature, but they're one of the biggest video game companies in the world. I think they can afford to do that. They definitely have the money. So basically, how it would work is the server farm would monitor the chat logs and voice comms of all games that are currently going on. But it would do this mostly off of its RAM, so if nobody is reported, then the records of the chat logs and the voice comms are written over and erased as, games progress. But if someone is reported, however, the server would then send that data from the game over to a hard drive for storage. Then that data would be stored in a folder associated with that player's battle tag. And once that folder reaches a certain number of entries, its contents would then be sent out to the United Nations of Overwatch for judgment. Now, I can only really see this working in matches. I don't know how it could really be implemented to report toxicity in the menus, but that's the best I got. So, yeah, just deal with it. Also, what kind of punishments would the United Nations of Overwatch deal out? Well, they could continue doing stuff like silences, but I think that they should also be able to issue straight-up bans, including permabans, if it was necessary. Because I know Blizzard has the capability to do permabans. They've already permabanned a bunch of known cheaters in Overwatch, so it's not like they don't have the capacity to do it. They do, it's just they're choosing not to for this kind of thing. But I believe that the United Nations of Overwatch should have that power to issue those permabans. Also, I believe they could also hold the power to mark players in-game as quote-unquote members of Talon, the terrorist organization in Overwatch. I think that would add to the lore of the game while also, having a functional purpose as well. It would give them, some flair next to their name in the lobbies and in-game, which would serve as a marker to other players playing the game that the player they are playing with has been reported to and punished by the United Nations of Overwatch for some serious offenses. However, the main reason why I think a tribunal-like system would work in Overwatch is in all the opportunities for rewarding good behavior that the game has. I mean, you look at LoL, all the players really, got rewarded for cleaning up, the community with was a little bit of flair next to their name. Now, for some players, this flair was a big deal, but for others, they couldn't care less about it. So, in Overwatch's case, I think that there are plenty of ways to incentivize the community to police itself. I'm talking free loot boxes, double competitive points towards that golden weapon they want, special player icons and sprays, maybe even special skins, ways to show other players in the community that they are upstanding members of the community. And I believe that alternatively to the special Talon flair that toxic players can get from being punished by the United Nations of Overwatch, players who report such nasty individuals, as well as, do other things like be helpful to others on the forums or maybe even cooperative in game, could be commended by both the United Nations of Overwatch or fellow players and eventually be branded as a quote-unquote hero of Overwatch. and they would get a special flare by their name as well, but this time it would be the Overwatch logo to show people that they are an upstanding member of the community. Now, the United Nations of Overwatch can give this to a player they've repeatedly seen report toxic players successfully, but also fellow players can give a player they've like a recommendation to the United Nations of Overwatch to receive this branding by clicking a new option called Commend Player in the drop-down menu that appears when you right-click on a player's name. You know how when you go to report somebody, you click on their name and you get a drop-down menu, and that's where you would go to report it. That's where I would put this Commend Player option. Now, when commending a player, it would work a lot like a report, but instead of explaining bad behavior, it would be explaining good behavior. I think that people are more likely to spend 20 minutes at a keyboard talking about this really helpful and nice person that they believe should be rewarded in Overwatch, rather than spending 20 minutes sitting at a keyboard recalling some really nasty toxicity that they're the victim of. So I believe that would work better than the system they have in place now. And I chose to do it this way rather than like doing something on the end card because I don't want people to just toss around these commendations all willy-nilly just because they can. If they want to commend a player, they have to actively make it their mission to do so. So, is this system I've come up with perfect? Hell no. It may not even work. But I do have a lot of faith in this idea, and I'd like to hear what you all think of it in the comments below. So remember, if you liked the video, leave a like. If you didn't, leave a dislike. Subscribe if you haven't already, and as always, I'm MisterMercy. Peace, everyone.